A month ago, we broke a story here that Brent Dancey, the new Chief of Staff to Alberta's Minister of the Environment and Status of Women, was a convicted violent criminal. About 20 years ago, he beat a man so bloody that he sent him to the hospital. Reading the transcripts from the preliminary inquiry, reading the descriptions by the witnesses who saw Dancey punch and kick the victim relentlessly, despite people pleading with him to stop, was truly shocking. It is no surprise why Dancey was sentenced to 9 months in prison and a 10-year prohibition from owning firearms or explosives, a ban that was only lifted in 2005. Hiring a former violent criminal to high public office is shocking to begin with. Add to that the fact that Dancey has a paper-thin resume and has no ties to Alberta, and it's just weird. Dancey had a few minor patronage appointments with the NDP in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and yet he was chosen over any of 4 million potential Albertans for the job. It's obvious to me why. It's a patronage gig doled out by Brian Topp, the Toronto-based Chief of Staff for Alberta's NDP Premier Rachel Notley. Anyways, it's a heck of a story, and we broke it the old-fashioned way. Someone who knew Dancey back in Saskatchewan sent me a tip. I simply filled out a form with the courthouse clerk in Regina, who searched his file, charged me for photocopying, and sent it to me. Journalism, as it's called. Before we published the story, I emailed and voicemailed Dancey several times, asking him for his comment, and the Premier too. I haven't heard back from either of them. It's a story, don't you think? Convicted violent criminal from Saskatchewan now runs a large department in Alberta's government, including the battered women's shelters. I mean, it's a big story to me, but it's been fascinating to watch the media parties handling of the story. The Edmonton Sun and the Calgary Sun don't have a word on this story, not one word. Isn't that funny? Is it not news for a tabloid paper that specializes in crime? Isn't that odd? The Edmonton Journal and Calgary Herald each ran one very short blurb about the story, but that's it. They have spilled much more ink on Premier Rachel Notley's fashion than on Brent Dancey. But over the past week, check out the stories that have been slowly poking up. David Fraser wrote this story in the Regina Leader-Post that also appeared in the Saskatoon Star-Phoenix, and even afterwards in the National Post. It mentions Dancey very briefly, but spends 90% of the story wondering, how did I get my hands on his transcript? I mean, it's a fair question, and the answer is that I just asked the court for it. There's a wrinkle there because Dancey received a pardon in 2005. His file was supposed to be sealed, but it wasn't. Okay, it's a detail in the story for sure. But think about it. The Leader-Post and the Star-Phoenix did not do a story about Dancey being a former violent criminal and getting the job in Alberta, but they did a big story about how I shouldn't have got my hands on those records, except for a clerical error. I love those headlines. Unclear who released sealed court documents on Alberta NDP staffer to Ezra Levant. Isn't that funny? To the Leader-Post, to the Star-Phoenix, to the National Post, the central fact of this story, the most newsworthy fact of this story, wasn't that a former violent criminal is now running an Alberta department. It's about me breaking the story. Look at those headlines. Brent Dancey's name isn't even in them. Mine is. Now look, I don't mind the attention. I think you know I love it. But I'm the first to admit I am not the center of the story here. The former violent criminal is, and the NDP who thought he was still the best hire in the land. Don't you think that's rather a larger public interest? But 90% of these stories and the headlines were process stories or even a little bit of a conspiracy theory. How did Ezra get this news? Isn't that wrong? Not, how did the NDP hire a violent criminal? Isn't that wrong? I like the conspiracy theory angle, as if I had perhaps broken into the court to steal Dancey's deep, dark secrets, except it wasn't a secret. He had a public trial and a public conviction and a public sentence. You can see all the court documents yourself at firedancey.ca. Anyways, an Edmonton Journal reporter named Paula Simons finally screwed together the courage to ask me how I found out the truth about Dancey, and I told her. And that led her to this magnificent column here in the Edmonton Journal. Check it out. The justice system itself cannot be above the law, with a picture of me. Not of Brent Dancey, the former violent criminal, a picture of me. And what follows is a rant, not against Dancey, but against whatever clerk gave me the file through a clerical error. Here, let me quote from the story. We should all demand to know why the system failed, because it failed us all. Laws shouldn't be broken with impunity, neither by 18-year-old punks nor by the Crown. If our courts can't be held accountable to follow the law, the rule of law itself goes out the window. Harumph! Seriously, the Edmonton Journal thinks a clerical error by a clerk is morally equivalent to a demonic brutal, relentless, violent assault that sent a man to a hospital. Note the sheer laziness here. No interviews with Dancey or the minister, not even an attempt. No attempt even to get Dancey's photograph. And the obsession with me and TheRebel.media that broke this news story, thus embarrassing the rest of the massive press gallery in Edmonton who didn't find the story. Or the last one either, about Graham Mitchell, the Toronto anti-oil lobbyist, who's the chief of staff to the energy minister. Or the other chief of staff, who's an anti-oil lobbyist, who works for the Human Services Minister. I think I'm living rent-free in the head of the media party because they're not doing their jobs and we're trying to. But really, despite their obsession and their headlines and their photos, this is actually not about me. It is about an Alberta press gallery that would prefer to write about Rachel Notley's amazing shoes than about her terrible patronage appointments for senior positions, including one to a former violent criminal. For TheRebel.media, I'm Ezra Levant.